So we have been talking about the beginning of American literature from 1400 to 1800, and we decided that's a lot of stuff. So we're going to go ahead and break that down into smaller sections. So we have already gone over Native American literature, and we've talked about early explorer literature, the Europeans in America. And we're going to go ahead and talk now about the fabulous Puritans. This is a special group of people who lived a very difficult life. The Puritans were around from 1620 to 1720. And they are a religious group, and I have to really push the idea that it is really incredible that the Puritans were around for 100 years and that's it. Religion is something that is usually rooted and lasts a long time. The Puritans did not. It's really because their lifestyle was often hypocritical of itself. It boosted others up instead of others. It inherently created jealousy. It lived on, worked off of fear. And there were so many reasons why being a Puritan just was an awful experience. So let's talk about how they got here. They arrived in America. The first set came in 1620. About 100 people arrived on the Mayflower. And then in 1630, 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony came, and they came on the Arabella. And so 10 years 10 years sounds like a really long time, but when you're arriving at a place that has nothing, trust me, that time, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. In the early 1600s, there was a large immigration to what they were referring to America as the New Land by people who were fleeing religious persecution. They wanted to practice their religion as they saw fit, and they were being persecuted and not allowed to do so. And the joy of a country that has not been ruled or governed or created or set up means the freedom is there, and America was very much that. And this is where the American dream is born, and that's definitely a topic that we'll be talking about throughout this course. So the Puritans specifically, which is a conservative, superstitious religious group, they fled to England because of that persecution, and they established religious colonies near land or on land. And their writing predominantly reflected their religious views, some of which can still be seen today in American culture, but not quite the same. And like I said, Puritanism lasted 100 years in America, and life was difficult, and many died, but they established a culture in America with help from the American Indians. And there were benefits from the Puritans over the years, things that they did that were helpful later, and helped establish for the next group. Their literature was very specific. It had strong use of personification, alliteration, repetition, simile, and metaphors. It had many biblical allusions. So that's a reference to something outside of the piece, specifically biblical. So if they were to talk about the perils of Jonah being swallowed up, it's kind of shorthand. It's easier for them to reference Jonah than it is to explain about his hardships, because everyone knows the story of Jonah, because for Puritans, they knew the Bible pretty well. And by pretty well, I mean inside and out. So it was kind of shorthand for them. That can make it difficult today to read, because if you are not as familiar with the Bible, that it doesn't really serve as shorthand for you. It actually becomes more complicated. They were very much concerned with the presence of the devil and sin, and there was a fear that the devil was everywhere and no one could be trusted. And that's how the Salem witch trials eventually come to be, and that's just because people were so afraid. And the devil is such a mystical figure, you just don't know where he could be lurking. They believed in the existence of diametrically opposed absolutes. So God versus the devil, good versus evil, those two very different ideas working against each other, definitely something they believed in. As for themes, they believe the devil is an active enemy of mankind, that he's not just there and waiting to tempt you. He's actively trying to tempt you. He's actively going for you. He wants to ruin your way of life, and he wants you to go to hell. They believed that the confession of sin required to be free, so you couldn't just be free. You had to confess your sins, and that had to be all out on the table. Adultery is considered one of the worst sins. Something called lechery, which we're going to see in the Crucible, is the indulgence of sexual desires. Anything sexual in nature is considered abhorrent to the Puritans. If you've ever heard of the Scarlet Letter, or if you've ever seen the movie Easy A, which refers to the Scarlet Letter, the main character has committed adultery and gets marked with an A, a scarlet A for adultery, to mark her. It's not considered an acceptable thing to do, and it is not forgiven. The function of Puritan literature was essentially to transform a mysterious God, because God just was so mysterious to them. I mean, he's this being, you can't see him, he's not tangible, and the literature was trying to kind of make that connection with him. Also to make God more relevant to the universe, to make you able to connect to him more, and to glorify him, of course. You're not going to find Puritan literature that's anti-God. That's not their way of life. Their religion believes in, and we call this, if you look down, you can see it says TULIP. TULIP going down. Total depravity. Something's depraved. They believe through Adam's fall that every human is born sinful. The concept of original sin, when Adam and Eve made that error in the garden, that is the original sin, and because of that, we're all born with sin. They believed in unconditional election, which is that God saves those he wishes, and that only a few are selected for salvation. It's the idea of predestination. Everybody's kind of on this preset track, and they're just riding it down the station, and there's no way to get off, so it's already set. And that not everyone is saved. Limited atonement is that Jesus died for the chosen only, not for everyone, which is not generally the Christian way today. Generally, Christianity promotes the idea that Jesus died for everyone, but the Puritans did not believe that. They believed in irresistible grace, that God's grace, which is defined as the saving and transfiguring power of God, God's power is given freely. You cannot earn it, nor can you deny it. And the perseverance of the quote-unquote saints, those who God chooses to have full power and to interpret the will of God, will live uprightly and do so. If God chooses you, you feel his power, and then you reject him, that's going against the will of God, which wouldn't be possible. So the idea that you could even do it is not possible according to the Puritans. This is tricky because, of course, somebody could say, yeah, God picked me, everybody has to listen to me, and there's no proof there. So faith, as you know, requires the belief in something you cannot see, and that was a big part of that. Grace is an experience where you are forgiven of the sins of envy, vanity, and lust, that you love God with all of your heart, and you can't make grace happen through your own work. It's a miracle from God, and only some are chosen. They believed in plainness. Think Amish. The simple worship in simple churches without stained glass windows or statues. They were not about things being gaudy or having gold or anything that would be ornate. And their clothing was plain, and they were just in general without decoration. They believed they had a divine mission, was that God gave America to the Puritans to be an example to the world. It's the idea of manifest destiny, that they are supposed to be a city upon the hill that everyone looks up at, and is a shining example. As for genres, the writing was important. They did spiritual biographies, which was essentially a diary of your daily religious life, talking about your signs of grace and whether you have it. They did poetry about religion and about daily life. And they had sermons, just like you would hear in church, that often refers back to biblical passages. One of the most famous sermons that we will be reading is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it was done in such a way that people were standing on the pews because they were afraid the floor would open up and suck them into hell. It was very intense, and people were very moved by it. Puritans bring the traditions of hard work, the belief in marrying for love, determination to overcome difficulties, the importance of God and religion. Education and the study for improvement of self-literacy was crucial, because if you could not read, you could not discover the truth which is found in the Bible. So thanks to the Puritans, the majority of Americans in the 1700s, so the boom kind of from them, they were literate, and that's how you end up with your Age of Reason people like Ben Franklin, because literacy was promoted so heavily and education was pushed and schools were made. Moderation, absolutely doing everything in moderation. Some aspects of the Puritan legacy, all right, the need for moral justification for private, public, and governmental acts, to make sure things are not just legally right, but morally right. The questing for freedom, to say, you know what, I'm not here and I'm not free, I'm going somewhere else and I'm going to find this freedom I seek. The idea that you don't have to settle for what is told to you, you can go for better. Their work ethic, they were always working. Sunday was their day off. They were not to be working on Sundays because, of course, that was their religious day. But other than that, you would find them out in the fields working. Very much. And what's interesting about that is they then made a lot of money, but because of their religion, they couldn't spend it or be ornate and fancy, so they ended up having a lot of money, but didn't do anything with it. They used elegiac verse, think like an elegy or a poem for someone who has passed away, because they were interested in death. City upon a hill, like I said, the concept of having to bring about all this goodness for everyone to see. So those are the Puritans. You can see why it wouldn't have lasted very long. Of course, you're going to have some jealousy in your own community and saying, well, why is he picked? Why wasn't I picked? And again, that fear, the idea that you could say, she's a witch. She came to me in my sleep and she pulled my hair and put a knife to my neck. And people would say, oh my gosh, that's crazy, instead of really thinking that through. This is where we see a lack of reason and rationale, and that became a problem. And eventually it just doesn't work anymore. People would work very, very hard because they believed it was the key to heaven, but again, they believed in predestination, so they were already kind of set. And so free will became very questionable. And it was just not a great life to live, and a lot of people didn't enjoy it, and it's not something that you would think, that sounds like fun. So that's why the Puritans kind of didn't last forever and teetered out. And then we had the Age of Reason writers come in, and that's who we'll talk about next. Thanks.